variation between two runs, each on a 50 parts per million known sample.
And did you examine, did Agent March run several known EDTA standards, 50 parts per million, to see what kind of peak heights he got?
Yes, of course.
And was there a lot of variation in those peak heights?
Yes, sevenfold.
And does that indicate anything to you as to whether you can use peak height to accurately determine concentration?
Not individual peak heights, no.
Now, let's say if you wanted to use this method as a way of quantifying how much EDTA you found, what would be the appropriate procedure?
You could do it if you used a internal standard that I'd mentioned before, where the ratio of the area of the peak heights is constant at a given concentration, and where the two behave in a very, very similar manner.
Now, with an internal standard, is that a substance that's very close to the EDTA, but enough different so that you can tell the difference?
That's the ideal, that you can tell the difference, but that otherwise the behavior is not significantly different. The properties are sufficiently different so you can separate them either with the liquid chromatograph or with the mass spectrometer.
And are those kinds of compounds available commercially?
Yes, sure.
Now, when you would use an internal standard, do you actually put the internal standard with the evidence that you're testing, or do you do it in a different run?
No, you do it right in the sample. The ideal thing is to, if you have a swatch like he had, is to put the internal standard on the swatch, known amount, and then extract it. Really, put it on the swatch, let it dry, let it age a while, because you didn't just prepare it, it's been around a while, and then extract it. You know how much you should find from that. Now, of course, you run also controls where you just put neatly the internal standard into the machine and see the amount that I'm going to put on the swatch would show up if I get 100% of it back at a certain height in a certain area. And then I put it on the swatch, then I put it in the water, and so that eventually you end up with a chromatogram like this with two peaks, close to each other but far enough apart so that you can tell one from the other.
And does that allow you, since you know how much of the internal standard you put in there, does that allow you to then quantify how much was in the evidence?
Yes, by taking the ratio of the, let's say, the height of the known over the height of the unknown, or vice versa, and comparing that with the standard, because that ratio is going to be reasonably constant.
Did Agent March use an internal standard in his testing?
No.
Is using an internal standard very common practice when running mass spec tests?
It is a standard procedure wherever you have one available, not only for quantitation, but also for retention time characterization. If one moves to a different retention time, so does the other. So again, that relative retention time is kept much tighter that way. It's almost become a requirement of chromatography, in quotes, of course.
Now, let's assume hypothetically that the stain from the back gate was put there using blood from a reference tube that had EDTA in it. And let's assume also hypothetically that the stain in the sock was placed there using blood with EDTA in it. Were you asked to consider the question of how much EDTA you would expect to find if you then tested those blood stains 8 months later?
Yes, I was asked.
Now, is it important when you're running a sample, if you want to determine how much of something like EDTA is present, that you know how much you start with?
How much sample you start with?
Yes.
Yes, of course.
Now, if you had a blood swatch, let's say from the back gate, or a piece of the sock from the sock that appeared to have blood in it, can you tell how much blood is there by just looking at it?
I can't.
What are the standard procedures use to determine the quantity of blood that might be in a swatch?
Well, you bring it into a water solution, preferably with a little ammonia because old stains are hard to get out. And you read that in a spectrophotometer for the hemoglobin content or for the hematine content, which is a fairly selective method, or else for the Soré band absorbing proteins, as you call them. That's one way. It's a simple way because you don't do anything to the sample. You can handle it afterwards, do anything you want to with it. You just put it in a light spectrophotometer and you get the spectrum, and at a certain wavelength against standards you determine how much hemoglobin is, which is what really the blood has most of, or if you're dealing with serum or plasma, how much protein based on the Soré band, which is also an absorption in the ultraviolet region. There is.
Are there any
other way? There are other ways of doing it. I mean, you know more about this probably than I do because you've been so well educated in this. You can determine the amount of DNA in it, and that tells you how much blood there was, because blood has a fairly known amount of DNA in it. You can also determine other substances in there that are characteristic of blood. For instance, if your background material doesn't have any iron in it, the measurement of iron in a sample like this is a good measure of hemoglobin, because most of the iron in blood comes from hemoglobin. Now again, assuming that this is blood, not serum or plasma, you can, what I usually do is spectrophotometry and or iron determination and or copper and zinc. If the background, you know, if I have a sample that's diluted blood and I want to know how dilute it is or how much there is. So you can do it. I mean, you know.
And is that equipment that you would expect to find in any well-equipped lab?
Oh, I'm sure that that's available. It's not.
You know where the FBI has that kind of equipment?
Well, I don't know what their lab has, but if they've got a instrument they have, I'm sure they couldn't do without the others.
Did you see anything in Agent Martz's work papers indicating that he used any method other than just looking at a stain to determine how much blood he started with from the evidence?
Well, I only saw in his papers here he made stain sizes on a cloth and said when I put a drop on I get so much stain, and when I put, you know, on another one I get such an area, and the area that I have is comprises a fraction of that, which I don't think is a workable way of doing it unless you do it to exactly the same material, do it many, many times, do averages, standard deviations, and other things. So, because what he had wasn't a drop of blood placed on the kind of material he was testing on, anything for that matter, but in the case of the gate, it's something that got wiped off a gate.
Now, did you evaluate or look at the method that he used to attempt to extract the blood that was in the evidence, the sock stain and the back gate swatch, to extract the blood from that?
Yes, I looked at it.
And what was that method, briefly?
Essentially, he took what he had, you know, what was available, a portion of it, and he put it into 25 microliters of water. And
Sustained.
Let me ask you
The answer is stricken. Juries to disregard the answer.
Let me ask you hypothetically, if you took, let's say, first of all, an old stain that had been on a swatch for 8 months and put it in water, plain water, let's say 25 microliters, and let it soak for 45 minutes and centrifuged it, is that an efficient way to remove all of the blood from the stain?
Objection, proper hypothetical, no
Overruled.
facts and evidence, no foundation.
Overruled.
it's a way, but you won't get 100%. You'll get a relatively low recovery from an old stain. You know, a dried stain where it's dried for all that period of time is bone dry. It won't all dissolve in the water, much less than all, just a small portion,
What's
or
the
just a portion.
What would be an acceptable technique to remove all of the blood
It's
from the
to
evidence?
remove all the blood. Really, what you would have to do is, if you could only use water, if you could only use water, is to repeat that. You put it in 25 microliters, you let it sit for an hour, you shake it for an hour, you centrifuge it, you take it out, put it in another 25 microliters, and every time you run some kind of a non-destructive test to see, are you still getting blood out, are you still getting blood out, until you don't see any more coming out. Then you are pretty sure you've gotten it all out. You can enhance that by using, for instance, dilute ammonia, which is a better solvent for dried blood than plain water. But it too, you have to establish that this will all come out by doing sequential extractions and measuring in each one the amount of the sample blood that's in it, in one way or another.
Would you agree that if you were testing an old blood stain to determine how much EDTA was present and you did not extract all of the blood from the stain, you're going to find a smaller amount of EDTA than might actually be there?
Well, that
Sustain.
If you don't I'm sorry.
Rephrase the question.
If you don't remove all of the blood from the evidence swatch, are you going to, and the blood has EDTA in it, are you going to find less EDTA than is in the whole stain?
Objection is proper hypothetical and also calls for speculation.
Or will.
Of course. I mean, that's very self-evident. If you don't get it all, you have less than if you get it all, whatever it is.
Now, incidentally, are you aware of any other case or any published literature on the issue of determining levels of EDTA in blood stains in forensic cases?
No, I'm not. I don't think there's anything published. I've asked around. I don't know of anyone who's done it.
Would you say that this is brand new ground in terms of that particular test I told you about?
Yes, sure. For EDTA in a blood swatch of this type, it's brand new ground. EDTA has been determined in blood, but not in a blood swatch, in a forensic case, etc., to any published extent or anywhere I know.
Now, the chromatography and the mass spec techniques, those are all techniques that have been around for a long time, haven't they?
Yes, they've been, the mass spectrometry and chromatography is fairly old.
Did you see anything in the paperwork that you reviewed indicating that the FBI did any studies to determine the differences between extracting blood from an old stain versus a new stain?
No, I did not.
By the way, if you have a swatch that's made from a blood stain, for instance, on a back gate, can you tell from looking at that swatch how much blood is in it?
I can't, no.
Can that vary from one swatch to the next?
I'm sure it will, greatly.
Objection, that calls for speculation as well.
Or will.
Now, in the context of the testing done by the FBI, what is a positive control?
A positive control in that context, as in any other context, is one to which the substance at issue has been added in a known quantity, and preferably not only in a known quantity, but to a known concentration. That means a situation where you know how much sample you have and how much you're adding. That's concentration. If you don't know how much sample you have and you put on it a microgram, then you know you've put 1 microgram in, but you don't know what the concentration is because you don't know 1 microgram per what.
Hypothetically, if you had a blood stain on a metal gate that was not collected, in other words, was out in the outside environment, subject to the weather and other environmental factors, for a period of from a day to 2 or 3 weeks, what effect would those conditions have on the presence of EDTA in the blood?
And,
Assuming that the original stain had been EDTA.
you put a wet stain on and you let it sit there dry and be exposed for a day or more
With EDTA blood, yes.
with EDTA blood. There would be some degradation from environmental factors. How much should really be determined experimentally, but I'm reasonably sure there would be because it's been done.
Objection, no foundation, lack of expertise.
Sustained. Answer stricken.
Have you reviewed literature on a study that determined what's called the photodegradation of EDTA?
Yes.
And what did that article tell you?
Well, basically that article tells you that if you have EDTA in solution, in this case, the EDTA in a German river called the Neckar, Neckar, and if you sample that with EDTA in it on a sunny day in Germany, that the amount of EDTA that's in that solution is going to break down, half of it's going to break down in less than 10 minutes from the sunshine itself. So that's photodegradation. It's because of the energy of the sun rays interacting with the EDTA in the water. The material that was used for that was an iron chelate of EDTA. Degradation of EDTA is described for sludge. It's described in the literature for bacterial degradation, so-called biotic, by living organisms, and abiotic, by the presence of oxygen and absence of oxygen. So it's known it degrades. If you take a sample of EDTA in blood and freeze it, it'll stay there.
Objection, Your Honor, this is outside the scope of
Sustained.
expertise. Also, the articles are relevant.
Proceed.
If you were trying to determine how much the EDTA you would have in an EDTA blood stain that had been subjected to 1 day to 2 or 3 weeks outside environment on a particular type of metal fence, how would you determine that?
Well, I've done things like this, and in this case it's obvious. You get a material which is as alike as possible to the metal fence, maybe a piece of the metal fence, and you put 10 dots of EDTA blood on it, and you put on it 10 dots of blood in other places of blood that doesn't have any EDTA in it. That's not in an EDTA tube, but it's normal human blood, which normally contains virtually no EDTA. Then what you do is you analyze a control, or more than one control. It means you take a little bit of an area where there's no blood, and you take that and try to know how much you have and analyze it. Then you wash off one of the spots that has EDTA, another spot that doesn't have EDTA. You analyze all three, and you repeat that every day for a week or something like that, for a portion of the time. If it's just for a few hours that you're interested in, then you repeat it during a period of several hours. You analyze it and you see where it's broken down. You know, whether the one that was put there an hour ago has less in it than the one that you took off right away and analyzed, or the one that was there for a week. And if during that whole period there's no breakdown, then you say, well, I don't know whether it would break down in 8 months, or 8 weeks or whatever, but at least I know that during that period it's stable. Usually in a substance, my experience is that substance that does break down, within a week you'll be able to tell that it does. Then carefully you can extrapolate, say that in 8 months there's going to be nothing there, or I think there may be some there, but that then becomes somewhat speculative.
Now, is that what you've described as possible methods to determine that? Is that part of what should be a validation study on the method?
Well, that's what I would call a validation of the method
you
for
see-
this purpose.
Did you see anything in the paperwork from the FBI indicating that they did any test at all to determine how much EDTA would have been lost under the conditions that we described?
No, I did not.
Now, let me ask you about the sock. Let's assume hypothetically that EDTA blood was put on the sock at some point in time. And let's assume further that between the time that blood was put on there and the time it was analyzed by the FBI, it was examined several times using high-intensity lights involving physical manipulation in the process of examining it. Can you tell us whether or not that would result in the degradation of the EDTA that was originally in that blood?
Objection, your proper hypothetical assumes the fact that it's not concluding
Anything else?
and calls for, I'm sorry, and calls for speculation outside the expertise.
Sustain.
Doctors, photodegradation, does that work when you shine a light on something?
That's what photodegradation is, from light energy.
And the one study that you've cited looked at photodegradation and found that it can occur with EDTA, correct?
Objection, is irrelevant.
What form of EDTA is used in the purple vials?
Well, actually, well, you want me to answer?
Yes, I'd like to know.
It can be there in several forms: iron EDTA, calcium EDTA, several others.
What was used here?
I don't know. I mean, it picks up iron, is what it does.
I understand that. But the one article you have talks about the water quality in the Neckar Valley River. A delightful place, that's why the Germans call it the romantic highway, but doesn't tell me a lot about this case.
Let me ask a different question.
All right, let me approach with a sidebar with Corporal Bliss. All right, ladies and gentlemen, I've wasn't paying attention to the clock, otherwise I would have taken a recess right at that point. So we are going to take our recess for the lunch hour. Please remember all my admonitions to you. Don't discuss the case amongst yourselves. Don't form any opinions about the case. Don't allow anybody to communicate with you. Don't conduct any deliberations until the matter has been submitted to you. We'll stand in recess until 1 p.m. Doctor, you can step down. You're ordered to come back at 1 p.m. All right, thank you. There was that study of water soluble EDTA is really relatable to EDTA in blood that has already bonded with the calcium elements.
Actually, Agent Martz's first series of tests that he did were looking for iron EDTA, and he found substantial, enough to measure, certainly. So it's there in the presence of the reference bloods. My only point about this particular article is, it's no question it's a limited article, limited circumstances. I'm not going to use this to have him express an opinion on how much degradation there would be with the sock, for instance. What I'm going to elicit from him is that in order to make the determination of what you might lose from the sock, you need to do testing on conditions similar to the sock, that you would not rely on this study to make an assessment as to whether you're going to lose any EDTA from the sock.
But aren't you asking the jurors to form an opinion by then bringing out the exposure to the infrared light and the microscope and high-intensity lights?
I'm going to bring out the fact that those are things that conceivably could result in some loss of EDTA, and they were never, that was never checked. And that's another way of showing that the testing that was done here is not adequate to show you how much you should have there.
But if we only have one study that tests photodegradation in water, in river water, as nice a river as it is, it's not really relatable to blood.
Well, it's iron EDTA, which is, we know is present in this blood. It was in solution at some time. It photodegrades. I mean, that's the only information we have, is that EDTA photodegrades under certain conditions. We don't have any studies that say it doesn't under other conditions. Our position is that this is something that would have been part of a validation study had it been
I
done
think
properly.
it's clearly enough for a scientist to be curious. But to say that EDTA under these conditions in blood photodegrades,
Oh, no, I don't intend to have, I intend to have him say exactly what you just said, that this is something that should have been checked.
I heard it a little more conclusory than that.
Oh, well, I'll clean that up.
All right, well, I want you to know I'm concerned.
No, I understand that, and I'll do that first thing.
All right. Ms. Clark?
Yeah, the problem that I have is that the manner in which the question and answer has been going is that the deliberate impression is being left that EDTA will degrade. Not only is that not...
Photodegrade. Photodegrade. Photodegrade.
Photodegrade, correct. I'm sorry, will photodegrade. And the problem with that is that it is not proven to be the case at all. And the testimony runs contrary to what we know about the stability of EDTA as a compound. And in the absence of this doctor having some experiment or expertise in that determination, and then that's not shown. So instead of just bringing out the fact that, and I think it's improper to cause a jury to speculate on that as well, there is no known literature or experimentation to document whether EDTA, especially in a dry stain, will photodegrade. And to cause the jury to speculate on that possibility when there's no showing of that, I mean, let's not forget something here. There's no proof that the blood was planted, period. And this is an effort by the defense, on the defensive, to take evidence of the fact that there was no planting, make it so confusing that the jury's going to go off the deep end trying to figure out what it is, and hopefully from their side, conclude that there was. I mean, that's really the bottom line here, because we have a premise that has never been shown and it can never be shown because it's not true. That's the biggest problem I have. But then, okay, if they want to do this, that's fine. But then to deliberately confuse and mislead the jury to make them believe that there could have been more EDTA there, which degraded because of the exposure to sunlight, is going way off the deep end in speculation, and that impression has definitely been left. And for Mr. Blasier to go any farther with this, asking the doctor about experiments confirming
So,
that.
Ms. Clark, I take it the bottom line of what you're trying to say is you're making a 352 objection
Yes, Your Honor.
based upon the lack of a scientific basis for photodegradation of EDTA in blood.
Yes, Your Honor. And just alluding to the fact that there is none creates the impression with the jury. You know what I mean?
Mr. Blasier, I really think her objection's well taken. I mean, that's why I jumped in there to ask the question, because I don't see the foundation to talk about this.
Well, again, I'm going to point out exactly what you said. My point is that the fact that there isn't any literature under these conditions shows that they never tested for that, so they can't say whether it would have degraded out or not. That's a deficiency in their experimentation where they tried to make some sort of quantification. It's not a valid quantification. That's one of the reasons why, because they never tried to simulate the conditions that we have in this case. That's certainly a valid point, I would assume.
That point is addressed by the fact that we have results on the socks. The results on the socks and on the gate, number one, do not give the full dollar spectrum. So to even call it EDTA is going out on a limb. But
Do we have any way to compare the result sock to the gate?
yes,
And what's the relative comparison?
the
I'm sorry,
gate's a little higher than the sock. But they're both dramatically lower, like by a magnitude of 100 times below the preserved blood. But yes, that's right, the result does not support the defense contention of photodegradation.
I don't know how she can say that. They didn't test for that.
All right.
Assuming that what the defense wants to say is true, that there is such a thing as photodegradation, the gate should then be lower than the sock, because the sock was not out in the sunlight for nearly as long.
Now, the gate is a completely different set of circumstances, which also should have been tested for and weren't. It's on metal, it's outside, it's subject to dust, to fertilizer, to other things that can also chelate with EDTA. They're different circumstances, and the levels of ionization that we're talking about, you can't quantify. Their 50 parts per million test on the same run has a 7-fold difference from one run to the next. I mean, you cannot use these ion counts as a way to say there's 5 parts per million versus 6.
No,
It's just
we're
not.
talking about the basis of the doctor giving opinions regarding photodegradation of EDTA. That's what we're talking about. I find it's not sufficient. I'll sustain the objection. All right, let's have the jurors,
Well,
please.
yeah, point of clarification. I asked him about the lack of any literature on photodegradation.
You can ask him if there's anything in the literature about that,
Okay?
other than this one article that we've already talked about.
Okay.
That's always been done, hasn't it, Your Honor?
It has.
In that case, it would be asked and answered. And counsel's just trying to highlight the very point that the court has ruled 352.
That's true. It's already in the record. So we'll proceed.
Stand, Your Honor? Or-
Yes, please. Doctor. All right. All right, let the record reflect we've been rejoined by all the members of our jury panel. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. And Dr. Fredric Rieders is on the witness stand undergoing a direct examination by Mr. Blasier. And good afternoon, Doctor. Doctor, you reminded, sir, you were still under oath. Mr. Blasier, you may continue with your direct examination.
Thank you, Your Honor. Dr. Rieders, I think we were talking at the break about environmental conditions with respect to the gate. Let me ask you if, and you described one way that you would do some testing to determine what effect that might have on the amount of EDTAs that you started with versus what comes off the stain taken several days or weeks later. You recall that?
Yes, I recall.
To answer that question properly,
Excuse me, Doctor, would you pull the microphone close to you, there, please? Thank you.
confronted with that set of circumstances, to answer the question, mainly how much EDTA might you lose under those
Sustained.
Did you see any evidence that the FBI did any studies whatsoever to determine what would be the difference in the amount of EDTA in a stain put on a gate with EDTA blood
Overruled.
subjected to whatever environmental conditions it was subjected to and then collected from a day to 3 weeks later? Did you see?
Objection, since that's not evidence that there would ever be.
Overruled.
No, I did not see anything along those lines.
Now, let me ask you hypothetically about the sock. Did you see any indication in the FBI reports that you were given indicating that any testing was done to determine what, if any, loss you might have in EDTA if you put EDTA blood on the sock at one point in time, subjected to changes in temperature, inspection under various different kinds of lighting, and multiple handling to determine how much EDTA might be left at the end of all that process?
No, I did not see.
Overruled.
If you were doing a validation study to determine that question, well, let me ask you this. If you were trying to make some sort of assessment on the quantity of EDTA that you would expect at the end of that process when you do the testing, would you do those kinds of studies to answer those questions?
Yes.
Would you just assume that it's not going to make any difference? And
Sustained.
did you see anything in the FBI reports indicating whether they did any studies whatsoever to determine whether there might be any oxygen or bacterial degradation of EDTA?
Objection, Your Honor.
Overruled.
Same objection. No foundation.
Overruled.
No.
Did you see anything in the FBI paperwork indicating that they looked at the question of what might happen to the amount of EDTA in a stain if some EDTA blood was mixed in with some non-EDTA blood?
Objection, irrelevant.
Sustained.
Now, you reviewed charts that the FBI produced of their positive controls for EDTA, correct?
Yes.
And what's your understanding of how those positive controls were made?
The positive controls were made by taking the material, for example, on a swatch, or just taking plain blood and adding to it EDTA, or taking known EDTA blood and see how it behaves.
Did you
But
see
it
any-
was all
okay.
fresh blood.
Did you see any indication of how long they waited from the time they put the blood on a stain until they actually tested it?
No.
Would that be significant? Would that be important to you?
Only if it were to exceed a normal laboratory period. You know, you start something, you continue that day or next day. If it was any length of time, yes.
And if you were trying to simulate what you might expect to find under the conditions which we have with the sock and the back gate, in your opinion, would it be adequate to just take a blood stain that's dried for a period of an hour, let's say, and testing it right then?
It does not at all reproduce the conditions of the specimen, so to that extent it is not.
Now, Doctor, the charts produced for the positive controls had relatively large peaks, did they not?
Yes.
And I'd like to have a chart marked, please.
1261.
I'm sorry,
1261.
1261. Let me show you what's been marked as 1261. Did you receive a bar chart like that in the material from the FBI?
Yes.
And let me put that on the Elmo. Now, doctor, does this appear to be a bar chart produced in the FBI paperwork? Can you see it?
I'm trying to read the one next to the large number. Yes, I received that.
And the up and down axis, the left axis there is the ion count, correct?
Yes.
And the various different bars indicate EDT or what matches EDTA found from various samples, correct?
Yes.
Now, does that particular chart in representing ion counts let me rephrase this. Did they run positive controls more than just those 2 times?
Yes.
Did they get large fluctuations in the ion count for different positive controls?
Yes.
Did they get different ion counts for their known standards as well?
Sustain.
Let me have 2 other charts marked.
It's his examination counsel.
Let me ask you one question about the chart before we mark the next set. The 2 columns on the left indicate dress. You see that?
Yes.
And they indicate approximately the same amounts from a sample called K65 and K65C. Do you agree with that?
No, the one on the right is substantially thicker than the one on the left.
Now you're talking about,
Number 2 is substantially thicker than number 1 as far as the height is concerned.
you're talking about the 2 on the left?
Yeah.
Okay. Are you aware of that was Nicole Brown Simpson's dress?
Yes.
Do you know what substance that was made out of?
I think it's one of the artificial fibers that includes EDTA.
Does rayon include EDTA?
In the process, yes.
Let me have 2 other charts marked
1262 is next in order.
1262A and B. For the record, 1262A is discovery number 4077 and is labeled 50 parts per million EDTA. And 1262B is discovery page 4070, also indicated as 50 parts per million EDTA. And these are both from February 22nd, Council. Dr. Rieders, let me show you two charts, 1262A and 1262B, and ask you if those appear to be charts testing 50 parts per million EDTA.
Yes.
And what are the times on those two charts in terms of when each sample was run?
One at 9:32 and 45 seconds in the morning, and the other one at 1:48 and 11 seconds in the afternoon of the same day.
Now, for the chart that has the number 4077, Your Honor, could we have slide V, 1257V? Doctor, could you tell us for chart number 4077, what was the ion count for 50 parts per million on that particular run?
For the area, is that what you want?
No, the peak height.
The peak height, 319,561.
Now, look at chart 4070, the same standard, the same amount, run later that day. What was the ion count later in the day?
49,393.
And would you agree that, assuming the chart is properly labeled, those two should be the same thing? Well, let me rephrase that. That the same thing is being tested in both of those runs.
Yes.
And do you find it unusual at all that the ion counts would change so much from one test to the next on the same day?
Outside the scope of the expertise, he doesn't claim to.
Sustained.
Doctor, do you interpret chromatograms all of the time?
Yes.
Do you
Yes.
do you look at peak heights and peak areas and retention times all the time?
Yes.
Do you have an opinion on whether ion counts under the conditions of the FBI's experiments can vary that much as shown in the chart, from run to run in the same day?
Foundation, see the
Oh.
scope of his expertise.
Oh,
Yes, I have an opinion.
What's your opinion?
Easily, because with the electrospray system, you get numbers that go pretty much all over.
Okay.
So
Yeah.
that's consistent with electrospray analysis.
Now, is this if you ran an internal standard with each of those, what if the equipment is working properly, what would you find?
Well, you'd find that the ratio would be the same if it's the same sample. Mind you, if it's a different sample, it could be, different blood, different thing. But if it's the same sample or the same batch for the analysis, then you would find the ratio is similar, provided everything went all right, even though the numbers are greatly different.
Now, have I asked you to take that off? Have you reviewed some material provided by Mr. Martz concerning the amounts of, well, let me rephrase this. Is EDTA appear or allowed to be present in food?
In food, yes.
What kinds of foods is it allowed to be in?
In some of the dried vegetable type things, like in peas and beans, according to the one FDA release that I have, in pickles, in a variety of foods. I don't recall any what you call basic foods that are eaten in huge amounts, like bread or something, but it might be, I don't know.
Have you reviewed the federal requirements in terms of the maximum amounts of EDTA that can be put into various foods?
I looked at them, yes.
And have you determined from those materials what you would expect to find in a person's natural blood who is eating materials with EDTA in them?
Objection. Let's go to the expertise.
Is that foundation?
Foundation.
Sustain.
Doctor, are you called upon to make calculations of how much of a particular substance might be in the bloodstream based on what you ingest by mouth?
If I have any idea what the absorption is, yes.
And is there a study that you reviewed in this case provided by Mr. Martz that talks about the absorption rate of EDTA into the system?
Yes.
And what study is that?
That is a study by Trujillo and, now the second name slips, in the 50s using radioactive labeled EDTA and fed to people.
And what did that study determine was the absorption rate of EDTA into the bloodstream when it was taken by mouth?
Objection, Your Honor, that study has no relevance to this.
Overruled.
I need to approach to explain.
With the court reporter. right, let me ask the jury to step back into the jury room, please. All right, the record should reflect the jury is withdrawn from the courtroom. Mr. Blasier, tell me about this report.
Your Honor, we got discovery from the prosecution on Thursday of what the Code of Federal Regulations allows by way of EDTA in food. I asked Dr. Ballard, who is present in court, who's one of our experts, who is not on our witness list, to calculate for me how much would that result in terms of parts per million, per billion, whatever, if you ate the maximum dosage in one day and it was completely absorbed into your system, and all sorts of other conditions which aren't terribly realistic.
Isn't yesterday a little late to be doing these calculations?
I was doing them over the weekend, Your Honor, and I provided them to Agent Martz. I tried to
Well,
fax...
wait. If EDTA in the blood is an issue from opening statements back in January, isn't this a little late to be doing this?
Agent Martz told me when I went to Washington last week that he had performed, a week before last, I guess it was, that he had performed some experiments on his own blood that showed the presence of EDTA. He also told me that he hadn't saved any of the data, that he had thrown it all away, that he had not produced the charts for us. I had to ask them for them, and he turned them over. So I assumed at that point that they were going to make some kind of an argument that maybe the EDTA in his blood is based on what he eats. And at that point, I decided to use their material and calculate what you would expect to find in your blood if you ate what you're allowed to eat in terms of EDTA.
Isn't that something that's pretty obvious as an avenue of inquiry?
Our experts had told us that you're never going to get above parts per billion from your diet. That, to me, that was never an issue until he says that he tested his own blood and found something.
All right. Well, the point here, though, is that you're attempting to elicit testimony from Dr. Rieders concerning a report that was not turned over to the prosecution, correct?
It was a calculation that I attempted to turn over to the prosecution as soon as I had it. They didn't have their machine on yesterday. I gave it to Agent Martz last night. I told him, if you talk to Marcia, please give him this stuff because I couldn't get it through on their fax.
As far as I know, our fax machine is always on.
I've got the proof in my file if you want it.
I mean, this is the first I've heard of this calculation. I don't know. That's why I'm attempting to confer with Agent Martz now to figure out what they did.
Well, I must say that the issue, I mean, it does pique one's curiosity since we know that EDTA is allowed in certain foodstuffs. It does sort of pique your interest whether or not it's naturally occurring in the blood. I mean, that's an inquiry that, you know, either side should have made a long time ago. And
We know that all the literature tells us that if it's there, it's going to be in the parts per billion range. That's what the literature says. And we provided them with material from the Environmental Protection Agency that also says you shouldn't see more than 2 parts per billion in humans.
All right.
That was given to them last week.
At this point, have you handed to the prosecuting attorneys a copy of this report?
No.
All right. The objection sustained. All
Your
right,
Honor,
let's
can
have
I
the jury,
refer
please.
to the Environmental Protection Agency material that I gave them last week?
It's in the public record, correct?
Yes.
Yes.
Thank you.
Let's have the jurors, please. All right, let the record reflect that we've been rejoined by all the members of our jury panel. Mr. Blasier.
Thank you, Your Honor. Dr. Rieders, have you reviewed materials from the Environmental Protection Agency with respect to how much EDTA you can expect to find in human blood from diet?
Yes.
And what is the range that would be in the human blood from diet?
Overruled. Overruled. For the EPA records, from FDA records that are in the public, part of the public record he can testify to.
What range are we talking about for EDTA in the blood from diet?
Normally, in normal individuals, not more than 4 parts per billion.
Now, the amounts of EDTA found on the sock and the back gate, what range are they?
It's in the parts per million, so 1,000 times more.
Do you have an opinion on whether the EDTA found in the sock and the back gate could have come from food?
From food eaten by the person whose blood it is
Yes.
that it? No. In my opinion, that is so unlikely that I wouldn't even consider it.
Now, what other sources of EDTA in blood could there be?
Well,
Let me qualify that a little bit. In the amounts shown in the back gate and the sock.
well, basically, in blood from an individual who had intramuscular or intravenous EDTA or EDTA preparations for one or another, either diagnostic or therapeutic purpose. I mentioned it's used for that. Within a short time, because within a day or two after such an administration, all the EDTA is out of the body. It's 90% in a couple of hours that it leaves the body.
Did you see any indication in the FBI paperwork that either Nicole Brown Simpson or O.J. Simpson had EDTA injected into their systems on June 12th?
No.
What other sources of EDTA are there in blood?
Accidental outside contaminations, for example, a syringe that is used to draw blood from someone could have been washed in detergent, and detergents have EDTA in them. EDTA could have been put right on that spot. I mean, it could be put on the whole sock, but then the control would also show it. So really there is no likely introduction of EDTA into circulating human blood other than its diagnostic or therapeutic injection, not orally. It's not given orally. It's bad for you given by mouth.
Do you have an opinion on whether the EDTA found on the sock and the back gate, in the quantities in which they were found, if that could have come from a purple top tube?
Yes, of course it could.
That's all I have.
Cross.
Thank you, Your Honor. Dr. Rieders, good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
Now, you just testified, sir, that according to you, your reading of an EPA report, that normally you will find no more than 2 or 4 parts per billion EDTA in a normal person's blood. Is that what you just said, sir?
Yes, that the
And-
normal is no more than 4 parts per billion. Right.
Okay, no more than. In other words, you're saying that the maximum amount of EDTA that you will find in a normal person's blood is no more than 4 parts per billion, correct?
That's what the EPA says, and I accept that.
And
I
you
have nothing better.
And that's based on a report that you had, is that correct, sir?
It's an EPA publication, the OMTADs, which is one of their publications.
Now, if what that, strike that. In the evidence stain, sir, you said you found EDTA in the levels of parts per million, correct?
I didn't find it. Mr. March did, and I agree that they are in the parts per million based on his analysis.
So the amount of EDTA found in the evidence stains on the gate and the sock were in parts per million, is that right?
Yes, because you cannot detect anything that is less than parts per million in any of the samples that he prepared or tested. His detection limit is in the parts per million.
The answer is yes. The amount that was found in the gate and the sock were in parts per million, correct?
Yes,
And the amount that should be found, the maximum amount that could be found in a person, a normal healthy person's blood, is in parts per billion, correct?
yes, according to the best available information.
And if that information is incorrect, and the actual information is in parts per million, then the amount found in the gate and the sock are a normal person's maximum allowable amount. Wouldn't that be true, sir?
If the best information is it's parts per million, then yes.
I have a report to show you, sir. We received the report. I'm showing to council now. I'd ask it to be marked People's next in order.
I'm sorry? 534.
Copy of the EPA report you refer to, sir? Do you have it with you?
No, I furnished a copy to you and to Mr. March. I mean, I furnished copies. Let me see what I have.
Mrs. Clark, the evidence number will be 537 on this.
Thank you, Alan.
What's the source of this report? Ms. Clark?
The source of that report is, excuse me.
Yeah.
Was,
I have a copy.
you have it, sir?
Yes.
Ms. Clark, may I have a copy?
The source of this is EPA, Your Honor. I'm going to show you what's now been marked as People's 537, and then I'm going to ask if we can have it copied for council, so they can keep it with them.
How many pages is that?
1 page. Do you see the
Yeah.
relevant passage at the bottom, sir?
Yes, I see the problem.
Yes, you see the problem, sir? Is that what you said?
No, I see the paragraph.
Oh, I see. And what does it say here?
Objection to the comments by counsel.
Sustain. Jurors to disregard. Ms. Clark?
I said clearly paragraph.
I'm sorry?
I said clearly paragraph, not problem.
Paragraph. Tell the jury what this means in terms of amount, sir. EDTA should not exceed 2 milligrams per milliliter of blood. What does that translate to in terms of either parts per million or parts per billion?
Huh. What that is, it should not be less than 2,000 parts per million. That's the same amount that you find in EDTA blood. At 2 parts per million, at 2,000 parts per million EDTA in blood, the blood won't clot. People would bleed to death all over the place. It's absurd.
It's absurd. This is the basis for the EPA report that you referred to, sir. This absurd thing here.
Excuse me, Counsel.
Let me show you.
I beg your pardon.
Wait. Is that a question, Ms. Clark?
It was foundational to a question. I wanted to show him the report.
Be careful, Ms. Clark.
Let me show you another report. Now, the report that you just pulled out from your briefcase, sir, I'm going to cite you to a passage where it says, in situ amelioration AML, dredge undissolved solid. That's in your report, correct?
That's part of their report. That's part in the copy that I gave you.
This is the EPA report that you used to base your opinion on, that the normal amount of EDTA that you'll find in blood, or the maximum allowable amount in a normal healthy person, would be in the parts per billion, correct?
This and the paper by Trujillo and Foreman is the other author.
Now, with respect to this report, sir, on which you just said you based your opinion from the EPA, you read that to allow for the maximum allowable amount in a normal person to be 2 parts per billion.
Right.
Right. Now, is it possible, sir, that you have a typo here that caused you to conclude there were 2 parts per billion as the maximum allowable, when in fact it is 1,000 times less, 2 parts per million as the maximum allowable amount in a normal healthy person?
It's possible that this is a typo, but this is a 2,000 parts per million is absurd, as I told you. The people would be bleeding to death at that level.
In other words, if this is the correct EPA report, you disagree with it.
Well, obviously. It's obviously it's a typo in there. Because I can't imagine that the EPA would say that it's all right to run around with blood that won't clot.
Sir, you earlier just premised your opinion on the maximum allowable amount for a normal person on the EPA report, correct?
That's correct.
And in your report it says 2 ng/ml.
Yes.
And you interpreted that to mean 2 nanograms per milliliter?
Yes, that's the only one possible.
That's the only one possible from an ng as opposed to an mg, correct?
That's correct.
And so you determined that what the EPA was saying was the maximum allowable amount was 2 parts per billion, correct?
That they were saying what is consistent with the radioactive study, and that's what they say. Yes, sure.
But the
Makes sense.
radioactive study, sir, was not able to pick up EDTA in the blood, was it?
That's correct.
It gave no lower trace amounts that it was able to detect or measure in blood, did it?
I'm sorry.
That report back in the 50s of radioactive EDTA did not state any specific amount for anything detected in blood resembling EDTA. Isn't that correct?
That's not correct.
I
What
object. I thought we weren't going into this. I mean, I'm happy to.
Sustained.
I can't.
Sustained.
What? What was the objection?
Court's previous ruling on this regard, that report.
The
Proceed.
witness continues to refer to it, then I'd ask the witness's references to be stricken.
Proceed.
You just testified that you based your opinion on this EPA report. Isn't that what you just did on direct examination, sir?
I didn't say I didn't base it on anything else. Yes, that's what I said.
Thank you, sir. And you interpreted that report to say that the normal amount you would find, a maximum allowable amount in a normal, healthy person, would be 2 parts per billion, correct?
Yes.
And that the amount that you found in the gate and the sock stains were in the parts per million, correct?
I didn't find it. The amounts that the FBI found were in the parts per million, yes.
And based on those differences, on the parts per billion that you would find in the normal healthy person, which is far less, wouldn't you agree, than in parts per million, correct?
Yes.
Based on that, sir, you concluded that the amount of EDTA found in the gate and the sock stains could not have come from food, correct?
It is reasonably certain that they did not come from food.
And that is based on the maximum allowable amount that
Excuse
you
me, counsel.
determine.
Counsel, you need to allow the doctor to finish his answer.
I'm sorry, doctor, did you finish your answer?
Question was regarding whether or not the EDTA and the gate and sock stains could have come from food.
Not from ingested food being transferred into the blood of a person from whom that blood came. That, in my opinion, is so unlikely that I would not consider it.
Now, doctor, that is based on your interpretation. That is based on the report from the EPA that talks about the maximum allowable amount of EDTA in a normal person, correct?
And on the Foreman and
And I will
Trujillo
object
paper.
to the latter part of it is non-responsive under 352.
Or we'll proceed.
And you also determined, then doctor, if your interpretation or your reading of that report saying 2 parts per billion in the normal healthy person is based on a typo, and in fact they meant to say 2 parts per million, what they are stating there in the 2 parts per million is consistent with the amount of EDTA that was found by Agent Martz in the gate and the sock stains. Isn't that correct?
I beg your pardon, it's 2,000 parts per million. 2 milligrams per ml is 2,000 parts per million, the same or more so than you find in an EDTA tube. That is blood that won't coagulate.
Did you see the report on which it's based, sir? In other words, you're insisting that this EPA report is wrong? Is that your testimony?
I don't say that the report is wrong if that's what they put in. I think it's either a typo or a complete absurdity.
Now, I'm showing you the report faxed to us by the EPA on which the report you have is based, and that's the one just shown to Council People's 357. And it says the same thing, does it not? 2 milligrams per milliliter? Isn't that correct?
You know, we still have a copy of this. Could we have a copy of this, please?
It describes the content of a paper. It is not a report. It says that observation on the effect of the concentration of EDTA on the packed cell volume of various domestic animals confirm that in man the concentration of EDTA should not exceed 2 milligrams per milliliter of blood. The citation is the British Veterinary Journal. So I don't quite understand it if this is on animals or why this applies to man. And secondly, if it is supposed to, this is not a report, this is an abstract of a paper, it's an absurdity.
But it does use the same amount, does it not, doctor? You see, so you have 2 ng/ml, they have 2 mg/ml, and we have a report that conforms to the report on which it's based. I just had you read it, have I not? Where
No,
it
you
says,
haven't.
Yes,
You
you
have
did.
not made me read it.
You haven't seen this, doctor?
No, I haven't seen this.
All right, Ms. Clark, this that Dr. Rieders has is what?
People's 358.
You mean 538?
538?
538. You have your numbers transposed.
Thank you, Your Honor. Let me write this down. Don't you recall us just reading this together, Dr. Rieders?
No, you read it to me. I didn't have a chance to look at it. This,
Right. Ms. Clark?
Have you read it, sir?
yeah, I've read it.
All right. So in my copy, it says
It's not
2 mg/ml, doesn't it? For the same
your
passage?
copy of something else. This is not the same. You will just please note that these are different references. It's from another base than what I have.
Yes, but the paragraph that it applies to is word for word the same as yours, isn't it, Doctor?
Except for that, that's correct.
Except for that. All right, so it's referring to the same thing, isn't it, Doctor?
I expect so, but I don't know that.
Well, you just read it.
Well, I don't know that it refers to the same thing, but...
Let's read it together, Doctor. Tell me when the words differ, all
They
right?
don't differ except for that one little thing that's absurd that's in here.
All right. All right, here it says 2 mg/ml.
Yeah,
Okay, the paper on which it's based that was sent to us from the EPA, People's 537, says the same thing, 2
The
mg/ml, correct?
excuse me, the paper does not say that. Their abstract says that.
All right, the abstract says that, correct, Doctor?
Yeah.
All right. Now, these are based on animal studies, are they not?
That's what the paragraph says. I don't know that paper. I'd have to read it to give you an opinion on it.
Yet, Doctor, you were willing to base your opinion on the parts per billion that you thought was actually written there earlier on direct testimony, correct?
Because all it did is corroborate what the radioactivity study showed, that they couldn't find any, and their detection limit is about 1 part per billion.
And, Doctor, in those radioactivity studies, there is no amount shown. Isn't
But
that
it's
correct?
clearly there. It's not written out, but it's clearly there. They used radioactively active labeled EDTA that they gave people by mouth. They could not detect it. They show you how many DPMs they can count at the various levels, and what is not detected is it's no more than 1 to 2 parts per billion. If
Doctor?
it's more than that, it's detected.
Doctor, what kind of equipment or facilities did they have for testing back then? Did they have the liquid chromatograph tandem mass spectrometer back then?
Oh, this has nothing to do with it. This is radioactive material fed to people, which is much more sensitive than any instruments that we have nowadays.
Well, let me
You
ask you
just
something.
can't feed it to people anymore.
Doctor, let me ask you this. Have you done any studies to take blood from normal people that is not preserved and tested for trace levels of EDTA? Have you done that?
I have done no such experiments. No.
Now, you wrote your report on July 17th of this year?
I guess so. I'll have to look at the date. It's the date that's on the report, whatever that is.
July 17th. And you got Agent Martz's reports back in the end of February, beginning of March, correct?
Which report?
The graphs and the notes by Agent Martz?
I don't remember the exact date, but probably in March sometime, I think. I'm
And
not
you
even
did-
sure I got them in March, but never mind. I got them quite a while ago.
And you didn't write a report documenting your findings until July 17th, correct?
That's when I was asked to write one, yes.
Otherwise, you wouldn't have written one at all?
I only write reports if I'm asked to write them. It's customary.
It's customary for you to do as you are instructed by the defense counsel that hire you, correct?
Only instructed in terms of what he wants me to do and what he wants me to give him. That's his prerogative.
Okay, and when you wrote that report on July 17th, you had not yet spoken to Agent Martz about his testing, correct? You had just
Right.
read what he had done, is that right?
Most of it, not all. I received some after that.
And after you wrote that report, you discovered that Agent Martz tested his own normal blood, unpreserved, for the presence of EDTA, and found EDTA. Did he not?
His results that he forwarded to me showed an EDTA peak in the blood that he processed, yes.
In fact, isn't it true, Doctor, that his own unpreserved blood came up very similarly in results to the blood stains found on the gate and the sock? Isn't that true, Doctor?
Surprisingly, yes.
Yes.
It
And-
excuse me, the numbers came up the same.
Hold on.
Excuse me.
Hold on, wait.
I'm sorry.
Wait. Let me see counsel at the sidebar with the court reporter, please. Thank you, counsel. Proceed. Ms. Clark, 230.
Thank you, Your Honor. Now, Doctor, as you've indicated, you are interpreting Agent Marcia's work. Is that correct?
His results, yes.
You did
His
not-
results, yes.
You did not do any testing yourself, isn't that correct?
None whatever.
As a matter of fact, your lab doesn't even have this equipment, does it?
We don't have the equipment that Roger Marks has, that's correct. Not yet.
Do you even have the liquid chromatograph tandem mass spectrometer?
No.
Let alone one that has the electrospray.
Well, that's just one interface. No, we don't have any.
As a matter of fact,
The only one that we do have is the ability to collect fractions and analyze them separately by the mass spectrometer, something which I've done.
you yourself have never operated the electrospray, isn't that correct?
That's correct.
Now, Doctor, wouldn't you agree that the person that would be the most qualified to testify and interpret the results of the operation of a given machine is somebody who operates that machine on a daily basis?
He should be the most qualified person to determine what the limits of ability of his machine are, since he works with it every day. Yes.
And in that regard, sir, you testified earlier that you thought retention time was a significant factor in determining whether or not these stains had the same qualities as those found in the reference blood samples with respect to the presence of EDTA. Isn't that right?
Yes.
And if an expert in the operation of this machine, such as Agent Martz, told you that retention time was an inappropriate factor to use because it is not discriminating for the presence of EDTA, wouldn't you agree that retention time should not be relied upon to determine whether or not a substance is or is not EDTA?
Well, if he were to tell me that, I would tell him that he's in error, because retention time is a characteristic of a substance in a chromatography system, provided there is some reasonable reproducibility of flow and other things that's possible. It's independent of the detection system and all these other things. And the variability may be greater in one than in another, but it is usable and it is used for that. Yes. That's what I would tell him. He didn't tell me that it's not applicable. Retention time is always a characteristic of a substance unless you change conditions completely.
Well, let me ask you this, Doctor. When you do testing to determine whether or not you think something is present, chemically speaking, wouldn't it be important to use factors that are as unique and as rare as possible in determining whether or not a compound is or is not a given chemical? Wouldn't you agree?
Only if you add the one other thing, and available. If you can do within the framework of what you can do, are you doing all you can to get the most intimately characterizing property of the substance that differentiates it from others? Yes.
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 Doctor, let me ask you this. If you are attempting to find women that look like me, wouldn't it be far more efficient to say you want a woman of this height and this weight, and I'm not going to say what that is, and this kind of hair and these kind of eyes and that kind of mouth and those kind of arms, as opposed to just saying I want a woman 5'6"? Wouldn't you agree?
Sustained.
Is it because of the weight thing, Your Honor?
It's too oblique for me.
All right. What I'm getting at, Doctor, is if you use criteria that are very broad, then you will include a lot that does not belong in that category, correct? As a general proposition.
Objection vague.
Oh.
I will use all available criteria, broad, narrow, microscopic, and assign to each one a probative value for what a scientist does, and that is applying what is called a null hypothesis.
All right, Doctor. Let me ask you this. If you assign probative value, if an expert in the operation of this machine, who uses it every day like Agent Martz, were to tell you that retention time has very little probative value because all chemicals seem to pass through at almost the same time, or within a minute, would you agree, Doctor, that that is not a factor that should be given great probative value in your determination as to whether or not a compound is or is not ETTA?
Well, if you were to tell me that, I would tell him that you are grossly mistaken, and if you earnestly believe that all compounds would pass through in a short time when you have a column, you don't know what you're talking about.
But, Doctor, you would agree, would you not, that someone who runs that machine every day would be a better expert, better able to determine what are the probative factors and are not, than someone like yourself who has never operated it. Wouldn't you agree, Doctor?
Oh, well. He should be, but if he says that, he isn't.
Doctor, isn't it true that most compounds will pass through this particular, the electrospray in particular, in about 1 minute?
They'll pass through the electrospray in 1 minute, but the separation occurs in the chromatography column.
That's right. And in the column, sir, how long does it take, if you know, do you even know how long it takes most compounds to pass through the column in the LC tandem MS?
That'll depend on what column and what flow you use. He doesn't say how much time it takes. He has everything down in terms of scan numbers. So I can tell you, it's a few minutes between runs, and that rather surprised me that so little separation time is allowed. And but that's all. I can't tell you a thing about it. If he knows what he's doing, then he's using a column to separate substances. As far as I know, he knows what he's doing, and that's what he's doing, so he separates them.
Doctor, he conferred with you on at least one occasion, correct?
We talked about this on at least one occasion, yes.
Okay. And as a matter of fact, you've had his reports or his notes and the graphs for months, correct?
That's correct.
Was there anyone who prevented you from picking up a phone to ask him about these questions, sir?
Yes.
Who?
It's not customary for me to do that. I asked the attorneys to get me additional information or to suggest that I call him up and talk to him on the phone. I got additional information, not all that I asked for, but I did not get their okay to call him. And although I realize I can do it, I'm a free man, it's not a very proper thing if you are going contrary to the wishes of the people that you talk to, unless those wishes are an obvious crime or something.
And the defense attorneys told you when to write your report and who you may call and not call, is that correct?
No.
You wait for their permission, is that correct?
Not their permission. I do not wait for their permission. I ask them whether they have wishes, not orders. And if their wishes are reasonable, I'll comply with them, of course.
Doctor, you're a scientist, are you not?
Yes.
It's important for you to get as much data, as much information as you possibly can so that your answers are all as correct and reliable as they can be. Isn't that true?
If I can obtain that information properly, yes.
And would it have been improper for you to ask Agent Martz to furnish you with information on the validity or the probative value of retention time, for example, in this particular piece of equipment in which he is an expert in its use?
Objection, argumentative vague as to what's improper, what that means.
Overruled. Either ask that question specifically or ask it in a more general way, which I did through the attorneys, and that is that I would like to see the validation data for all the parameters that apply to this analysis. Retention time is one of the most important parameters, and the validation data that I received contained retention times which put it exactly into the range that they were. So it worked fine.
Yeah, Doctor, you operate the gas chromatograph, correct?
Yes.
And the gas chromatograph, retention time is a very important factor, isn't it?
In every chromatography, retention time or RF or RT, whatever they are called, it's the same thing. They just attach different letters to them, is one of the characterizing properties of individual compounds, or sometimes of groups of compounds, depending on how you're doing the analysis.
And doctor, in the use of the gas chromatograph, you will be able to detect items by how long they take to separate, correct? And some items take a great deal more time than others.
Not how long they take to separate, but how well separated they are in the run.
By the time they get to the end of the column.
Well, separated somewhere, whether they are measured by the time they get at the end of the column, the time is recorded, and the time between one peak and the next peak has to be sufficient so that there are clearly two peaks.
And what is the amount of time, maximum amount of time, that it would take an item to go through your column, the gas chromatograph column?
That is so variable. I have substances that go through the column, through one column in less than a minute. I have others which take 40 minutes in that or in other columns. It is as long as you want it to be. For instance, in the EPA studies, there are runs that are 2 hours long. So, you know, it's what you're looking for and what you're doing. As long as you know what you're doing, you're all right.
All right, doctor, in your experience then with the gas chromatograph that you routinely operate, you can have items that run through the column for as long as 40 minutes, correct? That have a retention time as long as that?
Yeah, I think in one of the types of analysis that we do many different types. There is it's a screen and it extends over something like 40 minutes.
Now, doctor, if Agent Martz were to tell you that because of the way the electrospray works, he's required to use very volatile liquid to push the material through the column, such as ammonia. And as a result of that, just about all substances go through in 1 minute. What, in your opinion, would be the probative value of retention time?
It would still be the retention time of a substance within 10 seconds, 20 seconds, 30 seconds, 40 seconds, 50 seconds, 60 seconds. The last one is 6 times as long as the first one. So whatever the time is, I'm sure he isn't pushing it through a column for the fun of it, because if it's so close that you can't differentiate, why use a column at all?
Nevertheless, doctor, if that were the case, then wouldn't you agree that retention time is not a very discriminating factor in the LC tandem MS electrospray?
It is a discriminating factor. I don't want to assign to it very little. It's a discriminating factor. It's a property. It takes a certain length of time for EDTA to go through. So that's one of its characteristics. If he knows of 50 other substances not related to EDTA that have the same retention time, and if he'll tell me, then I say, well, then it still is a characteristic, but it is shared with other substances.
And so
now, if these substances are indeed things that you find in blood, then it's important. If they are substances that you only find in the Gulf of Mexico, then they are irrelevant. Because, you know, it has to be something that has a meaning in terms of the analysis that you do. If they are cyanide and other horrible poisons, then in this case it's irrelevant because there's none there.
All right. Now, doctor, then in that case, if there were, say, 50 other compounds that passed through at the same retention time, the probative value would be less.
Of
correct?
course, if you can tell me that that's so, I'd say it's less than if you only know of 2 others.
Well, doesn't the retention time to some degree depend on the kind of liquid used to push the material through the column?
Well,
Isn't that true?
Among other things, of course.
And if you routinely use the same liquid repeatedly, isn't it true, doctor, that you're going to wind up with a lot of compounds with the same retention or very similar retention time, as opposed to using different liquids?
I don't know that. No,
And
you don't have to. You have a good separation or you don't. I don't know.
And you don't know because you don't operate the electrospray, do you, sir?
Well, whether you operate the electrospray or not has nothing to do with that. Nothing whatever. Is if the whole retention on that column is 1 minute, then you're working with a separation within 1 minute. There are gas chromatographs which separate 200 compounds in 1 minute that you put in there. So I'm sure that the same thing can obtain here, although LC is less of a separator.
But you would agree with me, would you not, doctor, that if the retention time in the electrospray is very similar for many different compounds, then retention time is not a very probative factor. Yes or no?
It's a probative factor. Very, I don't, what is very? How much?
Well, didn't you just tell us, sir, that you determine how probative certain factors are?
Yeah.
All right. Then obviously there is some variance between the importance of certain factors and others, correct?
Sure there is.
All right. Now, with respect to Agent Marcia's blood, you have testified, sir, that since you wrote your report, you found out that Agent Marcia tested his own blood and came up with characteristics just like those in the gate and the sock stains, which you determined were EDTA, correct?
Well, there are too many questions in there. Let's take one at a time. Would you mind?
Is that an objection compound?
Yes, it is. Sustained.
Well, let me just show you a chart, sir. Now, while Mr. Blasier is reviewing that, I want to show you a chart that he showed you earlier. I'm putting up defense. Mr. Blasier will tell me in a moment.
1257. C.
1257C.
No, I'm sorry, D.
D. All right, you were speaking earlier, sir, of the fact that EDTA is comprised of the parent ion 292 and one proton is added, correct?
Yes.
And by the way, I think you indicated to counsel that the process of electrospray does not alter the ions. Did you say that, sir?
It doesn't change one chemical to another.
Testimony.
So that's
Was whether they changed them. Oh.
Didn't you testify to that, sir? Tell me.
I testified that electrospray does not change one chemical into another. That includes ions of one chemical into ions of another chemical.
Okay, but the ions are changed in some respect, are they not?
They can be. They not all are. The main thing about electrospray is that it is capable of driving otherwise neutral molecules, large neutral molecules, readily into the mass spectrometer. That's its great advantage.
Now, when you do the gas chromatograph, in the work that you've done, you measure the straight weight, correct? The straight weight of the ion with no additions.
No. At positive, I also use M+1, which is the molecular weight plus 1. That's what you get.
And that's what you do here, do you not? You're adding one to the molecular weight.
Yeah, you're adding a proton. It's a positively charged hydrogen atom.
All right, now you've testified, sir, that the parent ion 293 is one characteristic of the EDTA, correct?
Yes,
And that there is a daughter ion 160, correct?
yes.
But that is not the full daughter spectrum that you see there, isn't that correct?
Not here. The full daughter spectrum is all the daughters.
And the other daughter, which is not shown on this chart, is 132.
That's one other daughter.
And that other daughter ion, 132, was not present on the gate and the sock stains. Isn't that correct?
Oh, no, that's not correct. Remember that Mr. Blasier showed me a chromatogram which included the all three, the 293, the 160, and I think the 130 or whatever it was, And all three of them were there, although not in high concentrations. They were below the concentration at which the instrument prints out retention time, peak height, and number. It is below what is called the reporting limit of the instrument, the way it's set.
So what you're saying is, although you can't see it, it's really there?
No, I can see it, and so can the instrument. It just didn't label it. There's a big difference between that.
All right, so I want to go back to that chart.
All right?
All right, before we get to that chart, sir, we're going to try and locate that. Are you familiar with the term noise?
Yes.
And are you familiar with the maxim that a scientist requires 3 times the signal-to-noise ratio before saying that something could even exist? Have you heard that?
I've heard some people claim that, others 5, others 2, others 10. It depends on the circumstances. This is not from Olympus. The important thing in determining the presence or absence of something is, can you see it above the noise in one way or another?
All right, and when you say, can you see it above the noise, you mean that there may be kind of jagged lines like this, but in order to call a peak an identification of something or a detection of something, that one peak that stands out has to be 3 times higher than those other lower jagged peaks. Isn't that correct?
No, actually what is used is not that it has to be so much higher than the noise, but that it has to be higher by more than a certain number of standard deviations of the mean of the noise. That is what is used.
In which case, you would expect, though, to see on the graph one peak higher than the rest. Isn't that correct?
Either that or a pattern which is clearly different and more like something there than nothing there.
All right, now you're looking at this graph again, sir.
Yeah.
Did you mark it, Bob? What was the mark? What was the mark? Now you determined that on this chart is shown the other daughter 132 because at the same retention time, move over. Will you direct the arrow, sir, to where it was before? Tell the arrow where to go. See the arrow? Look on your monitor, yeah.
How do I do that?
Tell it to go right or left.
Go to the left a little bit. Hold. That's one peak. Go to the right a little bit. No, less than that. Here's another part of that peak. Go to the right. That, little more. Little more. That's it.
Above.
Now there's another one. Now let's go to a valley. Go over. No, go to a valley. That's it. A little bit to your left. Now go another arrow a little bit to the right. Okay, that's good enough.
And it's your contention that that proves what?
That the retention time of the first of these arrows is in one of the places where the retention time of EDTA has appeared. You have to bear in mind that this is a scan over an extremely wide range, so that there's very little energy available to scan any one ion. So it is much less sensitive than if you do the same thing and only scan for 160 or for 293, but it's still strong enough to show a pattern which matches that seen in the parent ion and daughter ion chromatogram,
All right. but
which
you
is
would
a
agree with-
focus chromatogram.
You would agree, would you not, sir, that the other random peaks there are not 3 times lower than the peaks that you've pointed out, correct?
They certainly are not.
All right. Now look down at 293. There is a very high peak in the very beginning, isn't there, sir?
The what?
That 293 is the parent ion, isn't it?
Yes.
Isn't it? And you see a very high peak where we've just put the magenta arrow? In fact, that's the highest peak on that graph, isn't it?
That's correct.
But you didn't call that, you did not identify that as the parent ion, even though that does have a high peak, maybe 3 times as high as some of the other peaks on that chart. Isn't that correct?
No, I did not, because I have nothing to go on to call it a parent ion.
Then in fact, what this graph shows, sir, in your opinion, as the 132, is based solely on the fact that you see something at the retention time.
At the same retention time where I see the 160 and the 292, and at the same retention time where in the more focused chromatogram that we looked at previously, where you can see much better that 160 and that it's in the same place, and even the pattern is somewhat similar. So that's why I say that you saw it before at 160. Now if you're scanning the whole thing, even though it is so much weaker, I mean, this is probably, I don't know, it could be as much as 100 times less sensitive than the 160 ion. You still see it. And in the same place where the 160 is, you also see the footprints of the 132 ion.
And so are you willing to say, sir, to a reasonable degree of scientific certainty, that based on this graph here of the 132 daughter ion, that it is present on the sock? Is that your testimony, sir?
That what is present on the sock?
The 130, that you have the full daughter spectrum on the sock based on this reading of your graph of 132.
This is the full daughter spectrum on the sock, unless there are other smaller ones, unless there are other little pieces around which are not looked here. And that's, in general, is the weakest, the least sensitive of the methods that he could use, but at the same time, it's more specific. You're trading off one for the other.
All right, Ms.
So
Clark,
is it-
we're going to take a recess at this point. All right, ladies and gentlemen, please remember all my admonitions to you. We'll take about 15 minutes for a break, and Doctor, you can step down. All right, Deputy McNamara, let's have the jurors, please. Going to break today at Deputy Jix.
3:45.
Can't squeeze 4 o'clock? You sure? Positive. Even if I call? Even if Deirdre calls? All right, Ms. Clark, you may resume your cross-examination of Dr. Rieders.
Thank you, Your Honor. Dr. Rieders?
Yes, ma'am.
Now, Dr. Rieders, it is true, sir, isn't it, that there is no known study that documents precisely how much EDTA would be present in a normal and healthy person's blood on an average. Isn't that correct?
On an average of how many people? The number of patients in the Foreman and Trujillo study on the whole had less than a couple of parts per billion.
No, doctor. First of all, in that article, it says nothing about parts per billion. Isn't that correct?
It doesn't
Isn't that
say
correct?
parts per billion, but it shows you it's less than parts per billion. With the strength of the radioactivity used, the detection limit is a couple of parts per billion, and they have negative bloods.
Doctor, that is not my question. Could you listen to my question, please? To your knowledge, is there any study in which they take the blood of normal, healthy people and test it for amounts of EDTA present? In other words, what would be present in an average person on an average day? Is there any such study?
A study with that title, I don't know of any in the literature. Blood EDTA determinations have been done in the course of other studies I've seen and none found, but they were not designed to do what you ask.
So
A large number of people and averages and all that, no.
There is no known study that indicates how much EDTA you could expect to find on the average in an average person, correct?
None that I know of.
But in fact, when Agent Marcia's blood was tested, a low level of what you call EDTA was indeed found. Isn't that correct?
I don't think that that is necessarily correct. What was found is that the sample that he finally analyzed showed the presence of some EDTA in the parts per million range. I cannot conceive that that is what's in his blood, in his circulating blood.
Nevertheless, doctor, you found what you would call EDTA in the parts per million in Agent Marcia's unpreserved blood, correct?
No, incorrect, absolutely untrue. I didn't find anything. He presented data which show that when he analyzed a sample of his un-EDTA'd blood, that in the process he ended up with a result that showed the presence of EDTA on the instrument. It doesn't prove that he had it in his blood, but what it does show, if he had it in his blood, he'd be an extraordinarily amazing, unusual person at that level.
Well, doctor, if other people's blood was tested, and I mean unpreserved blood, that gave the same results as did Agent Marcia's blood, would that change your opinion any as to whether or not he was a highly unusual individual?
Objection assumes facts, not in evidence.
Overruled.
I didn't say he is a highly unusual individual. I have not seen the validation of those studies, so I can't tell you whether the analysis is correct. If you ask me to assume that an accurate, reliable analysis of blood from Agent Marks and from others showed the kind of pattern that I saw in the material that he submitted to me, then I would say, yes, these specimens under those conditions, what I see here, in my opinion, is EDTA.
Doctor, you saw the test results for Agent Marcia's own blood, didn't you?
Mm-hmm.
Is that yes?
Yes.
And those results do seem to indicate, do they not, EDTA